It began like a thunderclap in the middle of a calm night. Rachel Maddow's voice, normally measured, deliberate, almost surgical, erupted with a raw intensity that no one watching had ever heard before. The camera lights burned hot in the studio, but it was her words, her scream of outrage that scorched across the airwaves. It wasn't the polished cadence of a broadcast anchor. It was the sound of someone pushed past the point of composure, a cry that cut through the static of politics and demanded the country's attention. Viewers at home froze, phones slipped from hands. On social media, fingers stopped mid-scroll. Something had shifted in that moment, something too real to ignore. This wasn't commentary, this wasn't punditry, this was an eruption, a release of years of frustration, and a collision between arrogance and dignity broadcast live to millions. The studio itself seemed to lean in, every producer, every technician sensing they were witnessing history instead of just another segment. You could almost hear the hum of the lights vibrating with the tension, the silence in the control room as Maddow's voice carried, first sharp, then louder, then unmistakably furious. And when Jasmine Crockett's words landed, words that had already struck nerves across the political spectrum, Maddow's reaction detonated with the force of a breaking dam. The scream wasn't just sound, it was symbol. It was the voice of every person who had been dismissed, gaslit, mocked for daring to speak truth. It was the voice of exhaustion, with lies and arrogance. In that moment, Rachel Maddow wasn't just a commentator, she became a vessel for millions. Clips flew across Twitter before the segment even ended. TikTok loops replayed the scream again and again, each time gathering thousands of reactions: shock, vindication, exhilaration. Memes lit up Instagram within minutes. Hashtags erupted across timelines. In living rooms and dorm rooms and late night diners, people leaned closer to their screens, whispering the same thing. Did you see that? And yet, for all the electricity of that moment, it raised a deeper question. What could drive one of the most unflappable figures in American journalism to such a breaking point? What was it about Jasmine Crockett's words that transformed calm analysis into righteous fury? Because this wasn't random. This wasn't impulsive. This was the climax of a story years in the making. But to understand why Maddow erupted like never before, we have to rewind the tape. The air was already charged before Jasmine Crockett spoke, but when her words landed, it was as if the floor of American politics cracked open. She wasn't offering commentary. She wasn't adding another soundbite to the noise. She was leveling a challenge, direct, unapologetic, and impossible to ignore. Crockett had aimed her statement not just at the hypocrisy in the room, but at the very machinery of arrogance that had dominated the conversation for far too long. What was at risk was more than reputations or political points. What was at stake was credibility itself, whose story would be remembered, whose truth would be written into the record. Crockett's words called out not just individuals, but a pattern, a culture of dismissal that had shadowed the voices of women, of immigrants, of working people who dared to stand tall. Her statement was a mirror, and in that mirror, the powerful suddenly looked small. The room felt it immediately. You could see it in the tightened jaws, the shifting eyes, the uncomfortable glances passed across the panel. Crockett had broken the unspoken rules of polite silence, the expectation that one should bow to authority and let the arrogance roll on unchallenged. Instead, she cut through with precision, pulling back the curtain on the contradictions no one wanted to face. And for the millions watching at home, it was impossible not to feel it. Viewers leaned forward, hearts racing, knowing instinctively that this was not just another televised debate. It was a line in the sand. FOMO swept across social media in real time. If you're not watching this live, you're missing the clash that just flipped the script. Clips were clipped, quotes were tweeted, live streams surged with new viewers desperate to catch the moment as it unfolded. It wasn't only the content of her words, though that alone carried weight like a gavel in a silent courtroom. It was the tone, the audacity, the refusal to flinch. Crockett's voice carried the rhythm of conviction, the kind that comes not from rehearsed talking points, but from lived experience, from the grit of fighting battles most pundits only analyze from a distance. In that defiance, people saw themselves. They saw their own frustrations, their own struggles to be heard, crystallized in a single voice daring to challenge power. And that defiance made the air crackle. You could sense the backlash already brewing, the villainous smirk of those who would twist, dismiss, or drown out her words in spin. You could feel the calculation of those who, caught off guard, scrambled to contain the blaze she had just ignited. But it was too late. Crockett had shifted the frame. The debate was no longer about what the powerful wanted to discuss. It was about the uncomfortable truth she had forced onto the table. That is why the moment mattered. That is why the room was electric, why silence seemed impossible, why tension built with every second that passed. Crockett Crockett had thrown the gauntlet down, and whether people agreed or not, no one could look away. And the person standing in the crosshairs? Rachel Maddow, who couldn't stay silent any longer. The eruption we witnessed did not appear out of thin air. It was born from years, decades, of a culture that thrived on dismissal, mockery, and arrogance dressed up as authority. The so-called gatekeepers of the conversation, those polished pundits with smug smiles, those political figures cloaked in entitlement, built their power on a simple strategy: belittle the challenger, ridicule the questioner, crush the voice before it can grow. It's an old playbook, one America knows too well. When truth threatens to surface, drown it out with laughter. When conviction threatens to expose hypocrisy, paint it as hysteria. When dignity rises in defiance, call it radical, dangerous, unfit. Again and again, the same tactic: shrink the brave so the arrogant can seem larger. These were the figures who filled the studio and the airwaves that night. Polished in appearance but hollow in substance, they cloaked themselves in authority while betraying the very ideals they claimed to defend. Their contradictions were glaring. They spoke of freedom, yet feared voices that refused to be controlled. They preached civility, yet delighted in sneers and interruptions. They demanded respect, yet gave none in return. And the arrogance wasn't just in their words, it was in the way they carried themselves. A raised eyebrow at Crockett's defiance. A smirk passed between colleagues as if to say, "She'll be forgotten in 5 minutes." A chuckle caught by a microphone that told the audience at home exactly how little they valued the truth being spoken. This wasn't debate. This was theater of dismissal, scripted by those who assumed the ending was already written in their favor. But arrogance is fragile, and hypocrisy, when spotlighted, burns brighter than the lie it tries to conceal. What these figures did not realize, or perhaps refuse to admit, was that the culture they had cultivated was not invincible. It was brittle. Every contradiction they spoke, every moment of condescension, widened the crack between them and the people watching at home. Because those at home saw themselves in Jasmine Crockett. They knew what it was like to be spoken over, to be told their perspective didn't count, to watch smugness masquerade as intelligence. For every raised eyebrow in the studio, there were a million clenched fists in living rooms across the country. For every smirk, a surge of frustration that could no longer be contained. The so-called machine, this ecosystem of arrogance and belittlement, thrived on the assumption that its targets would stay quiet, that outrage would fade into resignation. It was a cycle that had worked countless times before, but this time something broke, because this time the arrogance met resistance, and no one symbolized that resistance more powerfully than Rachel Maddow's eruption. Years of composure, cracked not from weakness but from moral force. She had listened, documented, analyzed. She had endured the smugness, cataloged the hypocrisies, watched the contradictions pile higher than any reasonable person could tolerate. And when Crockett dared to speak with a clarity the machine could not spin away, Maddow's fury broke through like lightning, striking a tree already split by storms. That is the truth the villains never see. Arrogance feels eternal only until it collapses. Hypocrisy feels untouchable only until a mirror is held up. Dismissal feels effortless only until the dismissed refuse to stay silent. The machine had hummed along for years, smug and unchallenged, but on that night in that studio, it finally met its match. But into this storm stepped someone whose calm fire had been building for years, weight of a career defined by persistence, clarity, and an almost stubborn devotion to truth. From the earliest days of her journalism, she built her reputation not on sensationalism, not on cheap theatrics, but on something far more rare: relentless honesty paired with compassion. Maddow was the anchor who could take the most tangled knot of politics and unravel it thread by thread until the audience saw clearly what the powerful wanted hidden. She never raised her voice for show. She didn't need to. Her weapon had always been precision. Her armor had always been composure. Yet beneath that composure lived a fire. Maddow's calm was not the calm of indifference, but the restraint of someone who knew when to hold back and when to strike. For years she listened while arrogance paraded as authority. She chronicled the lies, the contradictions, the corruption. She absorbed the weight of hypocrisy, not with resignation, but with patience. Each broadcast, each investigation, each night spent poring over documents and transcripts, it was all part of her quiet rebellion against a culture that thrived on keeping the public in the dark. And in that same landscape rose Jasmine Crockett. Unlike Maddow, she was not a journalist, but a fighter forged in the heat of direct confrontation. Crockett's journey had been anything but easy. She carried the scars of battles waged in courtrooms and on political stages where her very presence was treated as defiance. Young, black, unapologetically bold, she entered spaces that were never built to welcome her and claimed them with unapologetic force. Her weapon was not a broadcaster's scalpel, but a fighter's hammer. She struck directly, plainly, daring anyone to dismiss her truth. Her path, like Maddow's, was carved from struggle. She faced not only the expected resistance of political adversaries, but the constant drip of condescension that told her she was too much, too loud, too confrontational. But Crockett never dulled her edges to make others comfortable. She understood that comfort for the arrogant meant silence for the oppressed, and she would not play along. Every statement she made, every clapback that rippled across the internet was rooted in the belief that dignity was not negotiable. Together, these two women, though different in style and background, embodied a shared defiance. Maddow represented the steady hand, the relentless researcher, the quiet storm waiting to break. Crockett embodied the fearless challenger, the voice that refused to bend, even when bending might have been safer. Their lives told parallel stories of resistance, one through patience, the other through fire, and perhaps that is why the moment between them carried such force. Crockett's words were not new to her. She had spoken uncomfortable truths her entire career, but when she delivered them that night, it was as though every battle she had fought, every dismissal she had endured, surged forward in her tone. And Maddow, watching, felt it all, the same pattern she had chronicled for years condensed into a single defiant statement. For Maddow, the scream was not spontaneous. It was history breaking through the dam. It was the scream of every time she had watched arrogance belittle the truth. It was the scream of someone who had carried her composure like a shield for so long that the force of recognition finally cracked it open. She wasn't screaming at Crockett. She was screaming with her, with the truth, with the defiance, with the moment that proved dignity still had champions willing to rise. For Crockett, the clapback was more than a viral soundbite. It was a culmination of everything she had fought to represent. That voices long dismissed could not just survive, but dominate, could not just speak, but command the room. Her rise was proof that fearlessness could break ceilings, that unapologetic conviction could ripple from the halls of power into the homes of millions. That is why the world paid attention. This was not a spectacle manufactured for ratings. It was authenticity colliding with arrogance. It was truth meeting the smug machinery of dismissal and refusing to bow. Maddow and Crockett were not acting out roles. They were living out histories that had prepared them for this exact collision. And when it came, when their paths converged under the hot studio lights, when Crockett's statement cut through the arrogance like a blade, Maddow's eruption was inevitable. And so, when the words were spoken, everything erupted. The air settled just before a storm, heavy and expectant, the kind that makes every heartbeat feel louder than the clock ticking on the wall. She adjusted her microphone, leaned forward, and in that small motion, the entire room seemed to brace itself. Then she let it fly. Her words cut sharp, slicing through the posturing and the polished spin like glass shattering on marble. She did not hedge. She did not soften. Crockett declared in plain and piercing language what so many had been whispering for too long, that arrogance had replaced accountability, that hypocrisy had become the currency of the powerful, that truth had been buried beneath smirks and talking points. Every sentence landed like a drumbeat. Each pause dared the room to look away, but no one could. The faces around her told the story as clearly as her voice. One pundit's eyes darted nervously toward the cameras, as if begging them not to capture his unease. Another tried to smirk, only to have the expression falter halfway across his face. Even the so-called power players shifted uncomfortably, sensing that their dominance over the narrative was slipping inch by inch with every syllable Crockett released. And at the center of it all sat Rachel Maddow, watching, listening, absorbing. Her eyes narrowed, not in skepticism but in solidarity. She had heard arrogance 1,000 times before, endured it, dissected it, but hearing Crockett speak truth so plainly, so fearlessly was different. It was as though the years of restraint Maddow had carried were vibrating at the surface, waiting for the crack that would finally split the dam. The studio itself seemed to transform under the weight of Crockett's voice. What began as a routine panel shifted into a battlefield of ideas, the air thick with tension that every viewer at home could feel in their chest. The smirks grew thinner, the laughter dried up. A new rhythm took hold, one that belonged to Crockett, not the establishment voices who had long claimed ownership of the stage. And then it happened. Maddow moved. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the desk, her lips parting as though the words themselves were fighting to escape. Her composure wavered, not with weakness, but with a force too powerful to contain. Her face was lit not just by the studio lamps, but by conviction, by indignation, by solidarity. The audience at home felt it before she even spoke. That electricity, that gut-deep certainty that something extraordinary was about to happen. They held their breath. The chatter online froze mid-scroll, millions waiting, knowing that Maddow's silence could not last. And when she did react, when the eruption began, it was not simply commentary, it was combustion. The calm anchor became the voice of every viewer who had shouted it on their television, every citizen tired of being dismissed, every truth seeker hungry for someone to finally say what they had been screaming in their hearts. The balance of power in the room had shifted entirely. No longer did the arrogant voices dominate. They were shrinking, their smirks curdling into grimaces, their eyes flickering with something they were not used to, vulnerability. Crockett had lit the match, but Maddow was about to unleash the firestorm. The room, the audience, the nation, everyone could sense it. The buildup had reached its peak. Tension pressed against the walls like thunderclouds ready to break. But then came the counterattack, the moment that left the villain gasping for air. It began not as a shout, but as a tremor. Rachel Maddow's voice caught for just a split second, a crack in the calm veneer she had worn like armor for years. Then it surged upward, raw and uncontainable, a scream that wasn't weakness but power, pure, unfiltered moral outrage spilling into the air like lightning striking dry earth. The studio froze. The pundits who only moments earlier had worn smug grins now stared wide-eyed, their confidence evaporating in the heat of Maddow's eruption. The crew in the control room held their breath, hands hovering above soundboards, unsure whether to lower the volume or let the roar echo unbroken. For viewers at home, time slowed. They could see Maddow's chest rise, her jaw tighten, her hand slam once against the table as she unleashed a torrent that carried the weight of every contradiction, every lie, every act of arrogance she had endured. This was not analysis, this was judgment. The studio lights burned hotter, the silence between her words stretched long, every pause a held breath from millions watching across the country. "You do not," she began, her voice cutting like a blade through still air. Pause, silence, so thick you could hear the hum of the lights above. "You do not get to dismiss her. Truth." The final words rang like a gavel, crashing in a silent courtroom. The villains in the room shifted uncomfortably, the cracks in their composure spreading wider with each second. Maddow wasn't giving a monologue, she was leveling an indictment. Every syllable was a hammer strike against the smug machinery of dismissal that had long been allowed to run unchecked. And then, like an exclamation point on her fury, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were a scalpel, precise, deliberate, devastating. "You can call me loud, you can call me angry, but you will never call me silent." Word by word, the statement landed like blows in a boxing match. The first strike, defiance, in its purest form, claiming every label hurled at her as armor instead of insult. The second strike, redefining anger not as weakness but as justified fuel, the righteous fire of those who refuse to bow. The final strike, the knockout, a declaration that no amount of arrogance, no wall of dismissal would ever erase her voice. The studio was stunned. A hush fell so deep that for a moment it felt like the entire country held its breath. And then, like a dam breaking, applause erupted. Not polite clapping, but thunderous, cathartic, uncontrollable applause. Producers in the back exchanged glances of disbelief. The panelists who had smirked minutes earlier now looked as though the ground had been pulled from beneath them. The moment replayed itself instantly in the minds of those watching live. Crockett's words, paired with Maddow's scream, were already etched into memory, already transforming into something larger than the night itself. It was no longer just a debate. It was a rallying cry. Maddow's scream was the sound of years of patience finally giving way. Crockett's clapback was the sharpened edge of that moment, the line destined to ripple across timelines and hashtags for weeks to come. Together they formed a 1-2 punch of defiance and solidarity, a spectacle too raw to be staged and too powerful to be forgotten. Social media feeds exploded even before the applause faded. Clips of Maddow slamming, her hand, voice cracking with fury, spread at lightning speed. Side-by-side edits paired. Crockett's words with captions in bold letters, loud, angry, never silent. TikToks looped her line like a mantra, while tweets, stacked by the thousands, proclaimed, "This is the moment, this is history." And as the applause raged in the studio, as Maddow steadied her breathing and Crockett's eyes gleamed with fire, one thing became undeniable. The villains in the room had lost control. Their sneers had turned to silence. Their confidence had crumbled. The balance of power belonged now to the voices they had tried so long to belittle. But what made the moment unforgettable was not just the spectacle, it was the universality. Every viewer who had been told to quiet down, every immigrant who had been dismissed as an outsider, every woman who had been called too much, felt their own voice amplified in Crockett's words and Maddow's eruption. The scream and the clapback were not just television. They were a collective release, a vindication, a reminder that dignity could roar louder than arrogance. In that instant, Maddow and Crockett were no longer individuals. They were symbols. Symbols of resistance, of resilience, of the refusal to bow to dismissal. The applause rolling through the studio was only an echo of the greater applause swelling unseen across living rooms, phones, coffee shops, and city streets. Yet even as the walls of that studio shook with cheers, the true aftershock had only just begun, because in the age of social media, moments don't just live and die on television. They grow, they mutate, they explode across screens and seep into conversations, into culture, into history itself. And this one, this scream, this clapback was too electric to be contained. But the explosion inside that studio was nothing compared to what happened online. The applause inside the studio had barely faded when the digital storm began. Within minutes, clips of Rachel Maddow's eruption and Jasmine Crockett's razor-sharp clapback had flooded every platform, traveling at the speed of a nation hungry for validation. reaction. On Twitter, hashtags blazed across the trending column. Never silent, Maddow screams, truth, or Crockett clapback. Each refresh of the feed revealed another cascade of retweets, another chorus of voices claiming the moment as their own. It wasn't just viral, it was volcanic. Memes bloomed almost instantly. Screenshots of Maddow's fiery glare paired with captions like, "When you've had enough of the lies," spread across Instagram stories. TikTok edits remixed Crockett's words into soundtracks for everyday defiance. Students lip-syncing, workers mouthing along at their desks, teenagers throwing her lines into the ether with the intensity of protest chants. The frenzy wasn't confined to the grassroots. Politicians weighed in, some with careful praise, others with predictable condemnation. But the tide of reaction was unmistakable. Progressive leaders shared the clip with words like, "This is what courage sounds like." A senator tweeted, "Maddow said what millions have been feeling." Crockett reminded us why truth still matters. Even celebrities stepped into the fray. Singers, actors, athletes, all echoing the same sentiment. This wasn't just TV, this was a cultural earthquake, and the people chose their heroes. Crockett was no longer just a rising political voice. She was a symbol of resilience, a woman who had taken every insult flung her way and forged it into armor. Maddow, long respected as a journalist, was suddenly transformed into a firebrand, her scream not a slip, but a rallying cry. Together they embodied a dual force, intellect and fire, analysis and audacity, the calm before the storm and the storm itself. Commentators scrambled to frame the moment. Some described it as the most electrifying media clash of the year. Others declared it a turning point in how truth confronts power. The villains, once smug, found themselves cornered. Their attempts to spin the incident fell flat, drowned out by the roar of applause echoing online. No hashtag carried their names. No meme honored their smirks. The people had made their decision, and they had chosen defiance over dismissal. For ordinary viewers, the validation was intoxicating. Messages poured across comment sections. This gave me chills. Finally, someone screamed what we've been screaming at our TVs for years. Loud, angry, never silent. That's me. That's us. What Maddow and Crockett had unleashed was more than catharsis. It was ownership. The moment belonged not to pundits or networks, but to the millions who saw themselves reflected in the scream and the clapback. Even late-night comedians wove the clip into their monologues, their jokes reverent rather than mocking. "You know it's serious," one quipped. When Rachel Maddow goes from Harvard professor to rock concert frontwoman in 3 seconds flat, laughter followed, but beneath the humor was recognition. Something real had cracked through the polished facade of politics and television. It transcended screens. Protest signs appeared within days carrying Crockett's words. Marches and rallies echoed the phrase "never silent," as if it had been written into history long before it was spoken. Students scribbled it on notebooks. Workers posted it above cubicles. It wasn't just a quote anymore, it was a creed. And as the frenzy built, as hashtags burned brighter, as applause thundered from every corner of the digital world, it became clear that Maddow and Crockett had tapped into something timeless. Arrogance had tried to sneer and dignity had roared back louder. And yet, the story wasn't finished, because beneath the noise was a lesson too powerful to ignore. Rachel Maddow's scream, Jasmine Crockett's clapback, 2 moments fused together. That transformed a routine debate into something unforgettable. What you witnessed wasn't just a clash of personalities or another viral highlight. It was a defining confrontation between dignity and arrogance, truth and mockery, resilience and dismissal. The title told you what happened, but the story beneath it is what matters. Maddow's eruption wasn't random anger. It was the voice of millions who have carried exhaustion in silence. Crockett's words weren't just clever. They were the anthem of every person who has been told to sit down, quiet down, stay in their place. Together, they created a spectacle that was bigger than television. It was a reminder that when truth stands tall, arrogance crumbles. And this matters because it is not only their story, it belongs to all of us. Every immigrant who has fought to be heard, every worker who has been overlooked, every young person told they are too much or too loud. This moment was for them. It was proof that voices dismissed by the powerful can echo loud enough to shake the walls of the establishment. So if this moment inspired you, if you believe in voices that refuse to be silenced, share this video, subscribe, and stand with us, because this story isn't just theirs, it's ours. This is how dignity triumphs over mockery. This is how justice proves stronger than arrogance. And this is how one scream and one clapback turned into a movement no one can ignore.